In function and field, of course, we have this focus on the concept of time, specifically the temporality of the subject. Now, seminar one seems to be mainly focused on the notion of the subject and the subject reconstituting their history through speech, full speech. How can we think together the concept of the historicized past of the subject with temporality as it's laid out in function and field?
Okay, so just a couple of comments, and you'll get a sense that in the way I respond to all of these questions, that I'm trying to do something fairly modest. And that's, I think, often because, you're coming to Lacan for the first time or the second time or the fifth time, it's intimidating and it's very difficult. So what I'm going to try and do is just really put in some basic markers. And I've often thought to myself, I haven't actually expressed this publicly before, but I've often thought it helps to get someone who's not super clever, I'm talking about myself, to try and understand Lacan, because sometimes the more work you put into it, if it doesn't seem obvious and it's so difficult, there's something about the added work and the added attempt to try to explain it to oneself, which can be helpful. So sometimes, weirdly enough, highly super intelligent people teaching on Lacan don't always help us an awful lot. So thank God I'm here with my limited cognitive abilities. But okay, so one thought I had before we started was that there's lots of temporality. You could say there's lots of motifs, lots of signatures, lots of ways of thinking temporality in Lacan. And one of the things that is very striking about function and field is that function and field is initially delivered in the famous Rome discourse in September 1953. And when that happens, this is now 3 or 4 weeks prior to the beginning of seminar one. So I know you guys were a little bit interested in that, but just to foreground how important function and field is to the unfolding sequence of seminars that really, in a sense, begins with function and field. Okay, it's a matter of weeks before the end of function and field and the beginning of book one of the seminar, or the first seminar. Now, what's interesting is that if we take at face value the idea that Lacan's teaching proper begins with function and field, and that many of his many writings prior to that should be seen as his antecedents, his antecedent writings. This is a view propounded by Jacques-Alain Millet, by Lacan himself in many ways. And we know that in Écrit, he's got like a whole paper on my antecedents. Now, if that's true, there's one anomaly, there's one exception to that rule. And that exception seems to be the logical time paper. So what's interesting in function and field is he's looking forward. He's much more engaged with language, linguistics, structural linguistics, with those kinds of ideas, whereas exactly where he's headed for the next 10 years. But the one anomaly is that he still keeps on board, so to speak, logical time. So we could say, why is that? And there's a number of references back to logical time. And I should give you the date of that. I want to say 35. I don't know, maybe one of you could check that. But logical time, and of course, logical time is also included in Écrit. And of course, which would suggest that this is a bit of an exception to one of often the earliest material isn't all included. So why does he like this paper so much? And of course, that itself probably begs quite a complicated answer. But one of the reasons that he seems to like that, and it is because the famous idea, or one of the many ideas in the logical time piece, is that the human subject is conceived there, and temporality in its relationship to subjectification, we could say, is perceived there in the modality of pressurized time. A pressurized temporal dimension, that there's a preemptive dimension to subjectivity. Now, I just wanted to pause on that because sometimes there's a kind of mushing together of the motif of anticipatory certitude or anticipation. And we hear that a lot in the mirror stage where, this egoic entity, the process of moving through the mirror stage, or all of this anticipatory mastery that comes, which is a fundamental imaginary activity, and it's easy to give a concrete exemplification of thinking about how one sees in another, or one's mirror image, one sees some kind of hopeful, aspired to mastery that one then is in the slipstream of, and is always, in a way, it underlines the virtuality of the ego itself, right? That there's this anticipation. So what I'm saying is, instead of keeping those two things, both of which entail some facet of an anticipatory temporality, the anticipatory mastery that we hear about in the mirror stage, which seems to be the ongoing anticipation of cohesion, of bodily wholeness, of some kind of mastery, even if it's of motor, physical skills, of an ego who I am and an I. That virtuality, that anticipatory dimension, which is fundamentally imaginary, is very much part of the ego and very much part of the mirror stage. Now, maybe there's a little bit of overlap with what we're talking about, the pressurized temporal dimension, the preemptive quality of what he does in logical time. But let's also try to make sure that we don't just treat them as one and the same. On the one hand, we've got a time signature, you could put it that way. You've got a mode of temporality, which is about an anticipatory mastery, which is inherent in a sense to the ego's virtuality in and of itself. And on the other, we've got some kind of logical schema. And bear in mind, we've got the three times, the moment of the glance and so on and so forth in logical time. So they seem different to me. And they seem, one is very much more about a preemptive kind of quality to it, a pressurized preemptive quality. Now, they're interesting parallels because they both have an anticipatory quality to it, and they can both be thought of as ways of locating oneself subjectively. They can both be thought of in terms of what they achieve in terms of identification. But interestingly enough, we also get a distinction there. The kind of anticipatory mastery of the egoic moment in the mirror stage is very much about imaginary identification, whereas you could argue that the preemptive pressurized temporality to take on a subjective location of wearing a black hat or a white hat, or however we want to think about the logical time dilemma, is about how one precipitously, preemptively assumes a symbolic location to be that thing before I might be exempted from that thing, that category. So one, I'm arguing, is fundamentally about an imaginary process, and the other is fundamentally about a much more symbolic process. Now, I know that doesn't really answer your question, but it's interesting, isn't it, to keep in mind these modes of temporality. And there are some little bits of overlap, a little bit of difference, and they're both really crucial to how Lacan is going to think about temporality and identification. So I wanted to start with that differentiation and keep that in place. We could say also something about historicization, but let's just pause for a moment and see if you have any comments or thoughts about that kind of attempted distinction. I don't know if it works for you or if you had any other thoughts.
I actually have a question. So with this, and it kind of did answer my question about the difference between the logical time essay and then the mirror stage, as you're talking about like this anticipatory state of trying to master the lure. Definitely on one hand, it's, as you were saying, the imaginary, but he's also anticipating something that he will later develop, the symbolic structuration. And do you think this is why he kind of keeps saying, like, in the elaboration of his bouquet, inverted bouquet, like, we're not just the abstract I, we're not just the I? Is he trying to get out, like, there's something that the I is always situated in, and which would be the symbolic?
Yeah, I think the symbolic structuration point is a really good one. And it also anticipates something. I know you were interested also in questions pertaining to the gaze. So let's say something about that, and it helps us build upon and affirm something of the very elementary basic distinction I made between one, imaginary identification processes, and more a process of locating oneself in the symbolic. One of the things that Lacan wants to affirm time and time again in Seminar 1, very important for him and very important for Lacanian psychoanalysis, and he does it in terms of the gaze. He wants to say that there's a difference, a very important fundamental difference, and you could argue that much, well, I don't want to be too provocative or polemical, but maybe quite a lot of psychology doesn't really get this difference, you could argue. being provocative, that in the imaginary domain, we have an intersubjective dialectic. And in fact, we just gave an example of that because in this anticipatory mastery, I anticipate some kind of resolution, some kind of ability, some kind of mastery that I either see in the mirror or that I see in the field of my little others, right? So it entails that kind of intersubjective thing. In Seminar 1, he talks a little bit about the gaze, and he is both inspired by Jean-Paul Sartre's use of the gaze, but the more he goes through this, the more he wants to suggest that in many ways, Sartre's use of the gaze remains, in a certain way at least, within the domain of this intersubjectivity. Now, maybe Sartre scholars who know more about Sartre will disagree, but he does want to suggest that when we think, I mean, I can pull out the quote if we have time in a little bit. He does want to think, and you could say maybe one critique that Lacanians would offer of Sartre, which is entirely predictable, is that Sartre remains a little bit too phenomenological when he thinks about the gaze. And what Lacan wants is he wants always this subjective structuration, or in other words, it's not just the gaze of me, it's of you seeing me and me being aware of you seeing me. There's also the possibility of how we are both seen, or how I'm aware of being seen, a third person being aware of witnessing how I am seen by you. And of course, that takes us back to why very possibly logical time is important, because the dilemma, the kind of puzzle in the logical time paper also cannot be resolved simply by an intersubjective one trying to put oneself in the shoes of another, seeing what the other thinks and imagining, because there's a broader symbolic rationality, a logical way of thinking about it. So just to be a little bit more concise, and maybe I'll try and pull out that quote. It's always at least minimally triadic by which we would mean it's not just intersubjectivity, one person before another. Whenever there is that one person before another, that imaginary relationship, there's always notionally, nominally, even if one is not, particularly aware of it, the grounding location of a third. And that is a message he talks about again and again. So here's a quote on page 218 of Seminar 1. He's talking about the gaze, and he talks about how when we think about the gaze in perversion, the dimension of imaginary intersubjectivity is present. It's right on the top of page 218. Just now, I try to get you to grasp it in this double gaze whereby I see the other sees me, and that any intervening third party sees me being seen. But here's the part that I want to quote. There is never a simple duplicity of terms. It's not only that I see the other, I see him seeing me, which implicates the third term, namely that he knows that I see him. The circle is closed. And here's the real quote. There are always three terms in the structure, even if these three terms are not explicitly present. Now, I don't know to what extent that's apparent in Sartre, but as Lacan goes on, he makes this critique. He says, talking about Sartre again, having defined the intersubjective relations so clearly, Sartre, this is on page 224 of Seminar 1, Sartre seems to imply that if there is a plurality in this world of imaginary interrelations, this plurality is not innumerable, insofar as each of the subjects is by definition the unique center of reference. This holds if one remains on a phenomenological plane of the analysis of the in itself and the for itself. But its consequence is that Sartre does not perceive that the intersubjective field cannot but open onto a numerical structuration, onto the three, the four, which are our benchmarks in the analytic experience. Primitive as it is, this symbolism brings us immediately onto the plane of language. So he's covering a lot of ground there, but maybe to keep it as basic as possible, you could argue that in the world of Lacanian conceptualization, there's never a mere one-to-one intersubjectivity. Or differently put, there is, but that was within the imaginary dyadic domain. And that's always structured or implicitly anchored by the big other who looks upon this, who gives it some kind of meaning. And sorry for the slight digression, but I think that helps us think the difference between anticipatory mastery, which occurs in the imaginary, and you know, maybe the key engine for that, so to speak, is something about intersubjective relationship and imaginary relationship, and on the other hand, the relation that we see of the preemptive, time pressurized conundrum of locating oneself in symbolic terms. And the reason it's worth just emphasizing that again and again is that that's also one of the key messages of Seminar 1. And it's also actually a very practical thing. In other words, how do we implement that practically in ethical terms? And let me be careful about how I mention this. When I say in ethical terms here, I'm not referring to Seminar 7's ethics. I'm not referring to the field of everyday notions or philosophical notions of ethics. I simply mean ethical here as a treatment. How do one locate oneself in a treatment in an effective way? That's what I mean by ethics there, ethics, treatment. And what that means then is one will make errors, and maybe one will inevitably make errors. But if one locates oneself as a therapist, as an analyst, as the alter ego, as the intersubjective corollary, as the buddy, the friend, the little other of the person that one is working with, problems will begin to mount. One of which will be imaginary rivalry and conflict, one of which will be feeling good and the mutual, I love you, you love me, we feel good about each other, which is a nice part of human subjectivity, and hence it's great to have friends and people who love you. But that hugely confounds and problematizes the analytic relationship. So I know, sorry, I've gone on a long time about this, but another way of thinking about that is to say that what I'm calling the ethic or the ethics that's implied by all of this is really the L schema, I think. The L schema is going to give a rudimentary map, a way of trying to locate the analyst position within clinical work. And it's always going to be a position which systematically tries to step outside of being located as the little other, the intersubjective partner of the person who one is working with. I'm going to give you one little anecdote. I can never get through a 20-minute talk without giving some embarrassing thing. I'm obviously compelled to perversely give narcissistic enjoyment. But anyway, so I remember once in the course of my analysis having a dream, and it was like a Sherlock Holmes dream. And I was so delighted with this, and I gave my interpretation to the analyst, like, oh, it was a bit like I was Watson. And, you know, it's kind of like, I think, you know, you were Sherlock Holmes. And the analyst spluttered a little bit and coughed and opened the door and kind of implied, nah, that's not how to locate me. And there's maybe a little bit of ambiguity because Sherlock Holmes and Watson are not on the same level. But there's just a silly example to say that in a Lacanian treatment with a neurotic subject, that the analyst should take every opportunity to step outside of being located as their intersubjective other. Anyway, sorry, that was a long digression. We still got to get back to the historicization thing. But while I'm doing so much digression, is there anything out of that you may want to pick up on or return to?